In the last section, we created a new file where we are going to create a model that represents a user. So that's going to be the core unit of data inside of this application. It's going to be a user. We'll create a user model in this file, and then we'll end up testing it inside of our test directory. Remember that a user model represents all of the data in a single collection in our Mongo database. So when we create this user model, Mongoose will automatically create a collection of users in our database as well. When we want to refer to a specific model out of our database, we will create an instance of the user model, and that will represent just a single user. So in the last section, we left off with the first two lines inside of this user file, where we first required in Mongoose, and then we pulled off a single property called schema. We're going to continue work inside this file now by creating a schema for our user. In practice, this ends up being not too bad in like the very simple cases where we just have like a name property, but over time as we come back and start to add more properties in, the schema is going to get a lot more confusing. So for right now, we'll kind of keep the discussion on the schema a little bit light, but over time when we come back and talk about the schema more and more, we'll get a lot more discussion around it. So I'm going to create a new schema for my user, and I'm going to assign it to the variable user schema. So I'll say const user schema equals new schema, and I'm going to pass an object into this that's going to configure the schema that we're about to create. So I'm going to say that I expect every user in my application to have a name property, and I expect it to be a string. String right here is a reference to the base string class, or object I should say, inside of JavaScript. So this is a special global variable that you have access to inside the language. All JavaScript implementations have access to string right here, so this is not something that is tied specifically to Mongo or Mongoose. Now that we've created the user schema with a name of type string, we can feed this into Mongoose to create a new user model. So taking a look at this diagram, just to make sure it's nice and clear, the user model represents the entire collection of data that's inside of our database. The schema is just a very small component of that model. The schema is only something in here that kind of tells the model, hey, here's the different properties I expect this thing to have. So the schema is only a small portion of what makes up an overall user model. So below this user schema that we just created, I'm now going to create my user model. I'll say const user with a capital U equals mongoose.model. We're going to name this thing with the string user, and then I'm going to pass in the user schema to let this thing know that we expect it to follow the schema right here, where it should have a name that is a string. So I'll pass in user schema as the second argument. Now this line right here, this is where the real magic starts to happen. This is where Mongoose starts to do a lot of work behind the scenes. When we create this new user model, a couple things happen. First off, Mongoose says, hey, Mongo, do you have a collection called user? No? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make it. So this string right here is what controls what the collection is called inside of the Mongo side of things. Remember that Mongoose is really just a wrapper around the Mongo library or Mongo database, just to make our life a little bit easier. And so this is part of the simplification that Mongoose gives us. We don't actually have to go into Mongo and manually create a collection of users. Mongoose is going to take care of that for us automatically. The second argument in here instructs Mongoose about the schema that we expect this collection of users to follow. So by passing in the user schema right here, we're saying, hey Mongoose, anytime you're working with a user, we expect them to have a name, and that name should be a string. Finally, we return the result to user, or we assign the result to user. This capital U user variable right here is now what we will refer to as the user class along with user model. And we'll kind of use that term interchangeably, user class and user model. It does not represent any particular user inside our application. It represents the entire collection of data that's sitting inside of our database. Personally, I find that one of the hardest things to wrap my head around, at least when I was first starting out with Mongoose. Remembering that this thing is not representing a single user, it represents the entire collection of data. Now the last thing that I want to do inside this file is make sure that any other file inside of my application that requires this file in can get access to the user model that we just created. And I can do so by writing in module.exports equals user. Now if anyone else inside of my node project tries to require in this user.js file using a similar syntax up here at the top, they will get a reference to the user model. It's extremely common inside of every model file that we'll create in a project to export only the model class out of here. So anyone else that wants to make reference to a user or create a user or find a user out of the database can do so with the user class, user model, whatever you want to call it right here. Okay, so this file is looking pretty good. What we've got in here forms the absolute core of just about every single model that we'll ever create with Mongoose. So every other file that we'll ever make will have a very similar structure to what we have right here. We'll certainly add in new parts of schema and a couple other methods on user, some odds and ends, but in general, we'll have import statements at the top, create the schema, export, create the model, and then export the model at the bottom. Okay, this is looking pretty good. I think that we might even have enough code here to start writing some tests using Mocha. So let's continue in the next section and get started with that.